The case I'm going to tell you about today is one of the ones that had the most long-term consequences at an institutional level in England. Peter Connelly was only 17 months old when he came face to face with death. But his life had already been a total ordeal for much longer, with multiple hospital admissions for injuries and blows he had. On one hand, his mother said that the boy was very active and prone to getting hurt. On the other hand, possibly one of the biggest threats to the little one was living in his house. Her partner, a man with a past that could set off all the alarms in anyone's mind. But what had started as a tender relationship between stepfather and baby ended up being the start of unimaginable suffering for a baby who couldn't even defend himself or speak to get his mother's attention. In the media, they called him BBP, or Child A, because the investigation was still ongoing in the police. But once the corresponding arrests were made, the information was published. His name was Peter Connelly, and he was born on March 1st, 2006 in London, England. Shortly after Peter was born, his parents separated, and his mother Tracy took charge of their 4 children, allowing her ex to visit the kids. The woman and her children lived in a community that was somewhat disconnected from what would be the center of London, within the Haringey neighborhood. The relationship between Tracy and her husband had been up and down for quite some time, and like many couples, they believed that having another child could save the relationship. The children's father was not a bad person, according to those who had a relationship with the couple. The man had 3 jobs and took care of the basic household chores, while Tracy looked after the children. The children's maternal grandmother constantly said that at least he was not violent with her, in addition to the previously mentioned. But the marriage was still not happy. In fact, at some point prior to Tracy's last pregnancy, they both decided to take in a young woman who was having problems at home. In gratitude, she helped with the household chores, and even at some point began to call them both mom and dad. Over the years, when she reached adulthood, she left the house, but stayed in touch with the family. The young woman currently is the partner of Tracy's ex-husband. During this separation, the woman began to associate with a man named Stephen Barker, who also frequented the house where the family members lived.
This was what ultimately broke Tracy's marriage, and when she decided to bring Stephen to her school reunion as her partner, her husband decided to move out and start the divorce proceedings.
Shortly thereafter, in November, Stephen would move into the woman's house officially as her boyfriend. Although not many people knew this, as she kept it a secret from all her friends and people close to the family. Tracy had a troubled past, being the daughter of a completely absent man who had many reports of intimate abuse, and a negligent mother who had been forced to participate in a circle of those who liked the little ones, and who tried to calm her depression and sadness with alcohol. Tracy also suffered harassment, intimate harassment, and abuse from a relative, so her childhood and adolescence, well, were not ideal. In fact, those who knew her described her as a selfish, calculating, and manipulative person. And as an adult, she spent her days drinking alcohol, watching movies not for, and maintaining relationships with her new boyfriend. But when talking about her little son, she always did it with a smile on her face. She said that Peter was a wonderful child, and that the best thing that had happened to her was to be a mother. Although, according to her own mother, on the other hand, that is, the grandmother of her 4 children, she reached a point where, as they were growing up, she stopped taking care of them, and they had to fend for themselves. Imagine if it were about mothers and children in the animal world. Unfortunately, the problems with little Peter did not start when Stephen moved into Tracy's house, but months before. More precisely, unfortunately, the problems with little Peter did not start when Stephen moved into Tracy's house, but months before. More precisely in August, when Peter was about 5 months old. The doctors who used to check him began to notice some marks on his body that seemed to be wounds or scars from wounds. At first, Tracy said they were wounds that the little one made while playing. At 7 months, she had to answer the same questions again and told them the same thing. The little one had supposedly fallen down the stairs playing the day before. Coincidentally, as I tell you, the wounds they saw were on his chest and head. But they went with the mother's excuse, and while they tried to let this event pass, the information reached social services, who made the decision. When Peter was about 5 months old, the doctors who used to check him began to notice some marks on his body that seemed to be wounds or scars from wounds. At first, Tracy said they were wounds that the little one made while playing. At 7 months, she had to answer the same questions again and told them the same thing. The little one had supposedly fallen down the stairs playing the day before. Coincidentally, as I tell you, the wounds they saw were on his chest and head, but they went with the mother's excuse, and while they tried to let this event pass, the information reached social services, who made the decision, due to the high probability of severe damage, to go to the house and investigate the situation. The main question was, how could such a small child have fallen down the stairs? The family needed some kind of help, and it was also striking that the doctors were the ones who alerted social services, as they usually do not get involved in these types of family situations and prioritize the health of the child. But you can imagine how alarming it was. So at first, the neighbors remember that Barker seemed to have a good relationship with the baby. One neighbor in particular actually remembered that he used to see the man taking the baby to the park and going for walks regularly. Until sometime later, it became noticeable that Peter didn't want to be near the man. He said that when he approached, the child would start to cry and scream. A month after Stephen moved into his girlfriend's house, there was another alert from the doctor regarding Peter's health. The little one had a swelling on his head, possibly from a blow. The mother mentioned that she noticed this swelling the day after the child returned from spending the day with his grandmother. This once again involved social services, and they decided that, given this situation, Peter could not return to his home. The police decided to conduct an investigation into the case, and until that investigation was concluded, the child could not return to his home. Tracy was questioned by the police about the injuries that were found on the child over the last 5 months. Social workers took charge of inspecting the house and documenting how the family was living. So, only a month later, in January 2007, Peter was able to return home, something that perhaps should not have happened. But here the question is, why did they allow the child to return? A child protection team conference was held in which the results of the investigation were discussed, but it was not rigorous enough to obtain important data regarding the family's circumstances. Nor did they take into consideration some points that were of particular concern to the doctors. The doctor, who in fact made the first notification to social services, was not invited to participate, nor was he taken into account when the investigation was conducted, something that should have been done since he was the one who noticed the blows and would be one of the few people who would understand the severity of the facts. In addition, as an important point in this case, social services were not aware that Stephen Barker was living at the same address as the minors. Do you remember I told you that Tracy kept it hidden from all the family's acquaintances? Well, this might have been important in the investigation, as he is a person outside the family circle, and therefore could be a very important cause of the situation at the residence being altered. In the end, it was concluded that Peter's case should be registered under the categories of physical abuse and neglect. But it was of no use, as social services were not aware, nor had they analyzed the possibility that the baby was in a situation completely exposed to risks that could not be minimized. Then, in June, during a social services visit, they found marks on the baby's body again, and this time, they were reported to the police. A medical examination determined that these injuries were intentional, and that in the house where the baby lived, someone was deliberately hurting him. So once again, Peter was taken out of the house and brought back to live with the family that had previously taken him in. In July of that same year, the Department of Children and Adolescent Services determined that this case did not meet the requirements to initiate the investigation procedure into the child's care. So once again, Peter was taken to his family's house, and everything returned to a regrettable normality. Of course, the situation could get worse, and evidently it did. This time, Stephen decided that his brother should move in with them to Tracy's house. But he wasn't going alone. He would go with his 15-year-old girlfriend and their 3 children. So, at this point, the core of this household was made up of Tracy, her 4 children, Stephen, Stephen's brother named Jason Owen, his girlfriend, their 3 children, 3 large dogs, and also a couple of snakes they had as pets. How did 11 people manage to live in a house that was usually only for 5? Well, that's a question we can't answer at this moment. But what we can say is that both Stephen and Jason were bad people. Not only concerning today's topic, but also because they both had a somewhat dark or murky past and personality. On the other hand, Jason had been a member of the political party National Front, a far-right and fascist party and Stephen had a clear obsession with Nazism. Both had a criminal record, which included domestic violence, arson, and use of illegal substances. Jason, in particular, also had a complaint for having abused a girl of only 13 years old. Stephen, for his part, was not far behind. He was an avid lover of making small animals suffer, like frogs, which he skinned alive and broke their legs when he was little. Both had also become the terror of their 82-year-old grandmother, whom they used to constantly scare. And it is also said that they made her suffer physically to the point of locking her in a closet until she agreed to give them money. And, as if this were not enough, the investigation revealed that Stephen was the one who spent most of the time alone with the minor in his care. Something that should never have happened, evidently. On March 3rd, 2007, an ambulance was called to a house in North London, where paramedics found the lifeless body of a 17-month-old baby. My delegate peeked in the door. She told me, "We have a little boy who died this morning. And we know him. We know him. He's one of our children. He's on the list of protected children." The paramedics rushed to perform resuscitation maneuvers on the baby, but unable to make progress, they decided to urgently take him to the nearest hospital, accompanied by his mother. Unfortunately, he was declared dead at 12:20 in the afternoon. Of course, it was impossible not to notice the conditions in which the family was living at the time of the little one's death. There were magazines, porn, and bottles of alcohol scattered on the floor. The 3 dogs that arrived with the brother were dirty, and their fecal remains were left uncleaned, scattered in different parts of the residence, in addition to fleas that could also be found on the furniture in the house. The children were also dirty and had lice. Of course, paraphernalia from the German group, you know which one. From World War II, bladed weapons and replicas of revolvers were found in spaces where the children also spent time, demonstrating that there was no responsible adult in that house, and that any type of accident could have occurred if any of the children managed to get hold of any of these weapons. So when the autopsy was carried out, it revealed that Peter had injuries that had been overlooked by the pediatrician. This pediatrician who had examined him, but not just any injury. What they found was that the baby had broken bones in his back and also some ribs. It was confirmed that these injuries existed before Tracy took the child to the pediatrician. Poor doctor. The examination also confirmed that the little one had swallowed a tooth after receiving a tremendous blow to the mouth, had mutilated fingertips, and in some cases was also missing a nail. The police immediately began the investigation. Now yes, for having taken the life of this little one, this innocent, and the main suspects were Tracy, who was arrested at the hospital, Stephen, her brother Jason, and his girlfriend. The 3 fled and hid in a camp after learning of the baby's death. But they couldn't hide for too long and were promptly arrested. Let's be honest, this is a story about a 17-year-old girl who doesn't know how to take care of her child. It's about her boyfriend, who can't read but can hit a baby. The Department of Social Services gets substantial funds yearly, yet fails to safeguard children. Finally, on November 11th, 2008, Jason Owen, 36, and Stephen Barker, 32, were found guilty of causing or allowing the death of a tiny innocent or a vulnerable person. Tracy, who was already 27 years old at the time of the trial, had already pleaded guilty to this charge, so there were no changes in her case. Earlier in the trial, Jason and Tracy had been acquitted of the murder charge, particularly due to the lack of evidence to support this accusation, even though this sounds incredible, because we could consider that the more than 50 injuries found on this baby were enough evidence, but it was not so. Stephen, for his part, was declared innocent of murder by the jury present in the case. Then in April 2009, a second trial took place, in which the defendants were Tracy and Stephen. On this occasion, they were tried under pseudonyms and faced charges related to the intimate abuse of a 2-year-old girl. Apparently, the little girl was on the same child protection register as Peter and Haringey. In this case, Barker was found guilty on the charge, while Tracy was found not guilty of the child cruelty charge. Both trials were sentenced simultaneously on May 22, 2009. At the Old Bailey, Connelly received a sentence of imprisonment for public protection, and the judge's ordinance was that she be imprisoned for an indefinite period until she is no longer considered a risk to people, and in particular to small children, with a minimum term of 5 years, a total bargain. Stephen, on the other hand, was sentenced to life imprisonment for the intimate abuse of the 2-year-old, with a minimum sentence of 10 years and a 12-year sentence for his role in Peter's death to be served concurrently. In turn, Jason Owen was also luckily imprisoned for an indefinite period, with a minimum period of 3 years. Also a bargain. On the bright side of this situation, Jason's sentence was changed on appeal to a fixed term of 6 years, that is, doubling the minimum time he had to serve in prison. In turn, he was released in 2011, but it wasn't long before he was sent back to the correctional facility. Finally, the mother was granted parole in 2013, but returned to prison in 2015 for violating the rules under which she had been released. This led to him becoming ineligible for review for 2 years. From 2017, when she again had the possibility of applying for review, Justice Secretary Dominic Raab stood firm before the parole board by saying that the woman was the embodiment of the devil of evil and should not be released. He did this every 2 years, every time her name appeared as part of the parole applications. Something for which we have to thank this man. Then, in 2021, her parole was denied that would have set her free for the Christmas dates. But finally, in March of the year 2022, the board in charge of making these decisions considered that the woman was in a position to be released, as if having killed her son or being part of this crime had been a fluke. But, well, they referred to her case as a person who at that time was in a low-risk position to commit another crime, to which the whole board agreed. Finally, in July of the year 2022, she was put on parole but subject to restrictions in terms of what she can do and who she can contact. Her parole was denied that would have set her free for the Christmas dates. But finally, in March 2022, the board in charge of making these decisions considered that the woman was in a position to be released, as if having killed her son or being part of this crime had been a fluke. But while they referred to her case as a person who at that time was in a low-risk position to commit another crime, to which the whole board agreed. Finally, in July 2022, she was put on parole, but subject to restrictions in terms of what she can do and who she can contact. While in prison, Tracy was part of an intensive program from the Ministry of Justice and the Public Health Network for 3 years. So when she was released, she was rated as capable of working openly and honestly with professionals. She still insists today that she was not aware of anything that was happening within the 4 walls of her house, where Peter lived and in turn died in a regrettable way. Her lawyers say she has been unjustly convicted for the actions of her boyfriend and brother, and treated more harshly than other mothers in similar cases of neglect and abuse. In everything that happened in this case, almost. Because in fact I didn't mention Peter's biological father, other than at the beginning when talking about his history with Tracy. But very briefly, the man, whom we only know as Casey, and who was 33 years old when he met the mother of his children, who was 16, did not show up in the situation that surrounded his ex-wife and his children. But in 2012, it was known that he had won a lawsuit against the People newspaper when it declared in September 2010 that Peter's biological father was a convicted sex offender. The man's lawyer said the newspaper's editors were guilty of one of the most serious acts of defamation imaginable. The editors apologized and offered to pay them 75,000 euros in relation to damages and losses. The moment when Peter's case occurred was particular for the whole country and altered the way many services worked. But it was especially a before and after for English social workers, who now found themselves under greater pressure to recognize the dangers that might not be plainly visible in the cases they were responsible for. In fact, a particular social worker named Sarah recalled the way many agencies began to try to avoid certain cases, for fear of having another case like the BBP that was being heard so much at that time. At the same time, the police had also become a risk-averse agent, so more and more social workers were working practically without police reinforcement. On many occasions, they had to present themselves to work together to find evidence that would make the officers consider that their presence was required, as if they had a certain fear. And this obviously made social workers become defensive in their practice, focusing on following procedures instead of what would make the most difference for the children. Suddenly then, the priority for the workers and managers was to save their own skin before going out to review the cases that were being presented to them. Nobody wanted to put themselves in the shoes of the agency director, and everyone was terrified of what could happen. And meanwhile, In the real world, out there, cases of intrafamily child violence kept piling up, and the frontline staff couldn't bear all the responsibility. Fortunately, this case was the starting point for conversations about the responsibility of each of the country's police agencies to begin. And in the end, all we can do is hope that these cases do not repeat themselves in the present. And if they do, that they are treated with the corresponding respect, not as happened in this case. If you like these videos that are twice as long, leave me your comments below and see you tomorrow in a new video.